So welcome everybody. This is I Love You, Keep Going. It's Thursday, December 5th, 2024 at 7:35 p.m. Pacific time. And tonight what I thought I'd do is talk about the origins of preoccupied attachment and how that manifests in a way of beginning to make sense of the effects of early conditioning. Why that would matter to a meditation community, of course, is that we want to be able to see clearly the obstacles or the obscurations that keep us from a path of liberation. And often because what we're really talking about in terms of enlightenment is understanding what the enlightened view is and being able to hold that view, and how often the attachment views get in the way of that, and we're confined to that view that arises in early conditioning, which uh, changes the appearance of self and world. We do also live in this human body, which means we're subject to the nature of the biology of the body. And because attachment conditioning happens early and it affects actually the way that the brain forms, human beings are one of these, of a few species on the planet that largely develops outside of the womb. So we're born, we have an intact brainstem, a partially formed right hemisphere, not much in the way of a left hemisphere. And so the actual physical structure of the brain that we have is affected by the environment that we grow up in, and it grows in reaction to the environment. So the way in which your care was delivered to you when you were an infant and in early childhood actually shapes that basic structure of the brain. And so secure people have one sort of structure, preoccupied another, dismissing people another, disorganized people another. Uh, so talking about how that all comes into play, and then the the path out of that into a way of being able to attract that more clearly. The thing about preoccupation is also related to the way in which mentalizing and emotional regulation forms. We all basically are born as autoregulators, which means we're involved in ourselves. We don't really have much awareness of the people around us, and we develop strategies that are regulating within that confined system. So for the first few months of life. And then if a caregiver comes to us reliably enough that we reorient from autoregulation to depending on the emotional regulation care of someone else, we reorient toward external regulation. If the regulators come to us reliably enough and we can see and recognize clearly the um, the way in which they help us regulate, we can begin to learn these strategies for ourselves and develop the capacity to regulate ourselves. Once we have a broad enough range of skills in order to be able to regulate ourselves, we say that we have self-mastery and being able to emotionally regulate. But understand that in secure, functioning, collaborative, relational dynamics, the understanding is always that if you can't regulate yourself, you can depend on your regulators to bring you back into emotional balance. So it's this capacity to be really brilliant at regulating it yourself, and at the same time, this deep understanding that it's easy to get dysregulated to the point that you can't regulate yourself. And so then you come back to the caregiver then who helps you to re-regulate. And then once you're re-regulated, it encourages you to go and to explore some more. So you learn this value of regulating with someone else and going off and exploring and then coming back and regulating with someone. One of the other things that happens when you're encouraged to explore is the interest of the uh, caregiver in what you find out. And this is something that's really vital to the development of the capacity to explore, that you feel that the things that you discover that are important to you are of interest to the people that are central to your lives. And so that they're curious about what you found out. Often that's because there's a synergy there where the things that you find out actually help them with their exploration, and then the things that they share with you about their exploration also help with that. But when you don't develop a secure attachment, the circumstances are different than that. And really, what we're looking at from that earliest point of view of the causes is that the caregiver, while they come reliably enough to move you from auto-regulating into a dependence on an external regulator, they're not reliable enough to carry you into developing capacities to regulate yourself to the point of self-mastery, uh, or that they're reliable enough for you to actually feel safe uh, to leave them. That's really the thing that is one of the primary causes. The care that the caregiver provides to you in the dynamic that develops preoccupation is unreliable. It's unpredictable. In early mentalizing, you have spontaneity versus monitoring. So you learn to just allow everything to arise spontaneously, but you learn to monitor it continuously. And the way that that happens in early childhood, sorry, my voice is a little raspy. The way that that develops in early childhood is the the caregiver reflects back to you their experience of you. We don't really have the capacity as human beings to reflect on ourselves in any way that's accurate. What we do is rely on the reflections of other people to understand their experience of us and begin to evaluate and make sense out of the way that we're operating in the relationship. In that early dyadic experience with the caregiver, the child, of course, doesn't have the cognitive capacity to form any of these expressions in a way that would produce an outcome that would be desirable. And in fact, they probably don't even know what that would be. Am I too hot? What do I do there? Am I too cold? What do I do there? Am I hungry or thirsty, or do I need to be cleaned up? What is it that's happening and how do I communicate it? What am I feeling and how do I regulate my emotions? All of this is not a cognitive conscious experience with the infant. It's an expression, a spontaneous, unmonitored expression, which is then hopefully attended to by the caregiver who sensitively attunes and then reflects back to the child. So the child presents, the caregiver sensitively attunes, empathetically connects. They reflect back to the child their experience. And in that reflection back, the child begins to understand what those sensations in the body mean in terms of the facial reflection of the caregiver. And then when the caregiver ties to that a caring response to the child's presentation, the child begins to understand that if I make this expression, the caregiver understands it in that way, and that elicits a particular type of caring response from them. Is that all making sense? So, what we begin to identify in the expression of the caregiver is our internal states. And what we begin to learn from the caregiver is uh, uh, how to manage those states. And in order to do that, the child's expressions need to be reflected back in a predictable way that's similar enough that the child can recognize those particular patterns. But when you have a caregiver who misattunes, who doesn't understand accurately or accurately enough what the expressions of the child are, and whose attention is distracted, uh, the child doesn't uh, learn a value in monitoring what the caregiver is doing. When the child has to over and over again uh, uh, present in a way that will elicit a response from the child, but they don't have any way of understanding what particular pattern to use, they don't monitor or they don't develop the capacity to monitor. What they develop is a capacity to spontaneously express themselves in the hope of getting the care that they want. Is that making sense? So they don't tie a particular meaning to a particular facial expression or physical response to the caregiver because there's no pattern that they can recognize so that they could learn a collaborative form of communication with the caregiver. They become just constantly attending to expressions that might elicit the care that they want. Um, because they don't monitor and they're constantly needing to present themselves in a way that gathers the attention of the caregiver, what begins to happen is that they begin to enmesh in the mind states of the others, of the caregiver, so that they can understand what kind of presentation to make to elicit the care that they want. And in doing so, they lose track of their own uh, internal state experience and become more oriented around the internal states of the caregiver. So that gives them an other orientation rather than a self orientation. And it gives them an orientation toward an external presentation on the part of the caregiver rather than touching deeply into their own internal state. And because they're dependent on the emotional regulation of the caregiver, they orient around attempting to emotionally regulate themselves through the interaction with the caregiver and don't really develop much in the way of capacity to regulate themselves. And what that means is that they require proximity, constant proximity to the caregiver in order to feel emotionally regulated by them. So we talk about these different modes, the attachment mode, the exploration mode, and the collaborative relationship mode. In people who grow up to be preoccupied, the attachment system is constantly activating because it's so difficult for them to get it to settle. What we understand about the attachment system being activated, it deactivates the exploration system so that the child can seek proximity to the caregiver for protection and reassurance and the reestablishment of a sense of safety. But if the attachment system never deactivates because there isn't that sense of connection and safety with the caregiver, there's that sense of unpredictability and a sense of misattunement. Um, the exploration system doesn't turn on, and so the other aspect that's pronounced in preoccupied people uh, is a stunting of their capacity to explore. We talk about exploration in primary and secondary means. They're particularly stunted in the primary exploration, which is the pursuit of meaning that's unique to that child, and often are more oriented around secondary exploration, particularly if somebody takes charge of what that exploration can be. If a caregiver directs the child's exploration, the child can perform very well for the caregiver and often uh, uh, appear to be doing quite well, but their own solo exploration, where they're in charge of it and it's really oriented around their sense of meaningfulness in life, doesn't develop. Mudit?
George. Um, the preoccupied adult, I think I know somebody like as a close friend, does a verbal affirmation that, hey, you're safe with me, or like is there a way to make them feel safe when I'm with them as an adult, not somebody who's a kid?
Um, well, I think the verbal affirmation is good. Um, I think also uh, there needs to be an invitation for an authentic presentation of what they're thinking and feeling. And because they're so used to pretending to be who it is that you want, the invitation has to be presented in a way that they might actually try doing it rather than just inquiring what you mean by that and performing for you, if that makes sense. So, uh,
An example.
um, where would you like to go for dinner? Oh, doesn't matter. We can go wherever you want. No, I'm quite interested in where you want to go. What do you want to have? Chinese or what are you thinking? No, really, you can tell me whatever you want in terms of what it is that you want to eat. Um, you want to go for Chinese? And you say, you tell me what you want, where you want to go eat, and we'll go eat there. So that you put them in a position where they would have to explore, they would have to come up with a solution. And then you go and you affirm that it was a good choice and that you're glad that they made it so that they have a sense that they can do that and it won't result in uh, the usual bad stuff that they're expecting, which is abandonment, right?
Usually, usually they would say like no preference. I'm never sure if it's actually no preference or just a preoccupied state of mind.
No, it's not accurate because they probably have a preference. I can give you an example. Um, well, that's more of a disorganized response. It's they're always willing to do whatever you want so that they that you won't abandon them, and they're very reluctant to take any kind of authentic stance. And then if they don't like the restaurant that you choose, they feel free to pick at you because you picked the wrong place. That doesn't help them. What really helps them is not taking over the exploration from them and allowing them to do it.
Even though you can see them struggling, you just have to have patience to let them struggle for just a while. That's what I've
Yeah, no,
noticed.
they're struggling because they can't really do it. And so you say, it's not a big deal. Just take your time and figure it out. I have total confidence in you that you can figure this out. And I'm happy to go with you. And then I'll choose the next one so that it's a shared experience.
Thank you so much.
And then you do really have to have the patience to let them work through all of that internally.
This is not a Zoom background, by the way. It's real.
What
It's
time is it? What day is it?
noon on a beach. It's like 24 degrees
Ah, nice. In Celsius.
in Celsius in
And
Asia.
it's uh Friday afternoon.
I actually don't know what it is. Yeah, it's Friday morning. Yep.
Um, so now preoccupied, the problem with the exploration with preoccupation is that because they're dependent on somebody else to emotionally regulate them, they can't be separated from the person who emotionally regulates them, or they face dysregulation, which they can't really get themselves out of. And because that proximity to the regulator is paramount to them, they abandon the exploration for that. This happens early in childhood. They don't venture away from that. The other thing that happens to preoccupied kids or kids who grow up to be preoccupied adults in childhood is a kind of role reversing or involving, the involving in the mind states of the caregiver. Now, what I've described before was the involving aspect. The child becomes focused and enmeshed in the mind state of the caregiver because they need to know that information in order to be able to present the request for care that they need in a way that's likely to be effective. But there is also another aspect of that, which is we call role reversing, where the actual care of the caregiver is given to the child as a responsibility. So not only do they need to involve in the mind state of the caregiver, mesh with the mind state of the caregiver, but they are given the responsibility for the care of the caregiver. This doesn't happen until around 6 years of age because that's the youngest where the child's capacities are developed enough that they can do it. But you may have encountered children who are controlling. So what you notice in the way that preoccupation takes hold in adults is there's kind of two pathways. One is the helpless pathway where over and over again the person in front of you who doesn't appear to be helpless presents themselves as helpless so that you'll engage in helping them. Often what you find yourself is in a helpless loop where they present a problem for you to help them solve it. And you offer a solution which is rejected and the problem is represented. And you offer another solution and it's rejected. And over the course of time, everything you can think of is rejected and doesn't work. And the person in front of you remains helpless or they've tried all of the options and they haven't worked, and you begin to develop the sense of helplessness to help them. That's what I call being stuck in a helpless loop. But the other direction is controlling, and this is where they demand control of everything, and it that helplessness um, is um, turned into a moral stance of demand that you need to help them or save them. And it's takes on all sorts of um, stuff, all sorts of presentations, I should say. For a while in the meditation community, there was a strong demand that was given that everybody engage in scent-free products on retreats, and it became an extremely rigid experience around the use of scent-free products in order to prevent people that were highly allergic to scents from having these severe reactions to it. But that always, to me, felt like the aspect of controlling preoccupation, the demand for help, which is presented as I'm allergic to scented products, becomes this controlling atmosphere where you're prohibited from a kind of expression that you might make. It ceases to be voluntary. Christian?
I would have not bathed in protest.
Yes. uh, it did take on that quality in the Zendo. There reminds me of a funny story when we went to, well, no, actually I did. I went to Myanmar looking for a retreat center where we could go. And I went to Upandita, not Upandita, can't remember anyway. And it's a vast place, 700 acres or something like that. And it's divided in the middle with a wall, and one side is the female side, and one side is the male side. And I went into the meditation hall on the male side, which is a two-story building. And it really was like a putrid locker room inside there. It was an absolutely a blast of intense body odor. And then I went to the female side, and the windows were open, and it was light and breezy. And I immediately inquired if it was okay if I meditated on the female side of the wall, but I was absolutely was told no, I could not. I even threw in the I'm an old person, but that didn't help.
George, I studied engineering, so engineering school was similarly enlightening.
Yeah. Um, uh, so in these two pathways, the helplessly preoccupied tends to be on the organized side, and the controlling side of preoccupation tends to head over toward the disorganized side of it. One of the things about being dependent on external regulators in adults is often that you're in a constant state of emotional dysregulation because you don't have constant proximity to the regulator. And so you run around with this very high level of emotional dysregulation, sometimes on the controlling side, easily into the tantrum mode of dysregulation. The Then the dilemma is, how do you interact with people who are empathetic and connect to you and feel empathetically what you're experiencing? And what often happens, and this is kind of the way that the experience of people is organized into the types of relationships that they have with adults. Secure people who are empathetic and naturally pick up on that empathetic state of the other person will experience you as constantly in a state of dysregulation and helpless to re-regulate, which will create for them a disharmony in terms of internal states and experiencing that. Two people that are highly emotionally dysregulated don't regulate each other very well. And so preoccupied people don't tend to align with other preoccupied people because the intensity of each other's dysregulation is more dysregulating. Dismissing people because they have the capacity to suppress emotional, the empathetic experience of other people because they suppress their own emotions, don't have an empathetic response to the dysregulation of preoccupied people because they don't experience it consciously. So it isn't something that drives them away. It's one of the things that sets up the dynamic of dismissing people and preoccupied people forming relationships. Because the dismissing person is not emotional and is very self-oriented in the way that they operate in the world, they like to draw people to them to take care of them. And they don't depend on an exchange of exploration with somebody else to remain interested in them, so that the deficits that the preoccupied person has don't disqualify them from being in relationship to a dismissing person. So what you see most often in that kind of a coupling is a dismissing person with a preoccupied person. the preoccupied person is willing to abandon their personal exploration for physical proximity to somebody who's emotionally regulating for them. And because they're so oriented toward the other person and they enmesh to the other person, really what you'll notice is that the emotional experience of the dismissing person becomes the primary emotional experience of the preoccupied person. And then the preoccupied person attends to emotionally regulating the dismissing person. And when the dismissing person is regulated, the preoccupied person feels regulated because they've displaced the empathetic experience of the other with their own emotional experience. When they're separated from the dismissing person and the empathetic connection is broken, the preoccupied person often feels an extreme distress of the separation because they're then forced to attend to their own emotional state, which is often highly dysregulated. Is that making sense in terms of how that dynamic works? So the preoccupied person is dependent on the exploration of their regulator because they don't separate in order to explore from them for themselves. And they often identify the relationship as the primary means of their own exploration. They think that the relationship or the connection to somebody else is what's supposed to provide the meaningfulness of their life. And because it doesn't really do that, they're often in a state of deprivation, which keeps them in a dysregulated state and in a state of dissatisfaction. That making sense. They don't have the capacity to separate and do solo exploration because they can't regulate themselves. So they can't solve the deprivation experience on their own. And they turn to their partner to do it for them. That's part of the helpless manifestation. All making sense, the dilemma. So, what really needs to happen in order for a preoccupied person to move out of preoccupation into a sense of more security so that they can begin to develop their capacity to explore? And this is really the turning the attention from the enmeshment with the mind state of the other person and paying attention to their own mind state and beginning to understand what those internal states are that they're experiencing. And then to begin to develop emotional regulation strategies that they can use to regulate themselves. Once they begin the capacity to emotionally regulate themselves and not depend on an external regulator to do that, and they can regulate themselves well enough to separate from that caregiver, then they get into a place where they can actually begin to explore. And that actually is harder to do for most preoccupied people than the emotional regulation piece, which you can learn through the various meditation strategies that are part of our always cool, always kind grouping. But the exploration requires you to understand what it is that's actually meaningful to you. And because nobody has ever really reflected back to you what your qualities are, this is the thing that we count on in other people reflecting back to us what our authentic interests are. Partly that's because we don't ever really express what our authentic interests are because we're enmeshed in the mindset of somebody else and need to present something to them that they'll find responsive or that they'll respond to in a way that makes us feel connected to them. We need to begin to express ourselves authentically. There's a lot of conditioning around this that comes in childhood. And so that authentic expression is not simply a decision that you make, but it requires a lot of emotional regulation. You express, or the way that I like to describe it is, if you're not so so far down the rabbit hole of inauthenticity that you even can recognize what's meaningful to you. When the authentic expression comes to mind in response to the present moment, and it causes abandonment terror, immediately what arises is the mind. In the mind is the inauthentic thing that you could express instead. If you express the inauthentic thing, it immediately relieves the abandonment terror. And the delusion is that that's actually supportive of the relationship. You're no longer frightened about being abandoned because you haven't expressed yourself authentically. You've expressed the thing that you think the other person would find acceptable. But a little while later, you're going to be angry that you didn't express yourself authentically, even if they did respond to the expression that you made because it wasn't authentic. It isn't your authentic needs that are being met. And you're back in that familiar state of deprivation in a relationship to somebody because of the fearfulness around expressing yourself authentically. So you begin this process of expressing yourself authentically, which activates the abandonment terror, which means you have to be able to hold that experience of abandonment terror and continue to express yourself authentically. And if you do that, the abandonment terror will subside and you'll be hit by the terrible sadness, which is the recognition that for so much of your life where you weren't willing to express yourself authentically, you didn't get the things you need and you didn't actually even make a valid attempt at getting them. Not making sense. So that, and as you express yourself authentically and people respond to you much in the same way that they did in the inauthentic expression, you begin to understand that all the way along, had you been able to express yourself authentically, you had a much greater chance of getting your needs met. And that is a terrible sadness. So I think of it as a bittersweetness. The bitterness, of course, as you recognize for so long, you're the one who didn't ask, and that's why you didn't get. The sweet part, of course, is that in order to have that insight, you'll have to begin to ask authentically. And then you'll begin to see that actually you can receive from people the things that you need from them. The same way that you elicited attention from people by presenting a false self, you can elicit attention from people by presenting your authentic self, except that this time they're really interested in you. They want to know what's going on with you. They want to participate with you. And so you begin to have the sense of being seen, being known, being valued. Whereas as long as you're hanging out in the pretend side of things, you never have that feeling, really. In fact, you have a constant anxiety that they discovered what was really true about it, that you would be abandoned. Is that making sense? So you begin to track your own internal states. You begin to develop ways of emotionally regulating yourself that don't depend on somebody else helping with it. And then you begin to explore what actually is meaningful and what isn't meaningful. And that back and forth. Then you move into a place where you can be in collaborative relationships. How's that sound? I can see from your expressions that I'm totally unconvincing. You can do this. It isn't, it isn't even your fault in the sense that you adapted to the experience of your family system and what was available to you in your family system. And to have survived this long in life means that you learned those lessons well, that they weren't ideal lessons to learn is something else. But the capacity to understand what's happening and to adapt to them, you have all of those capacities. Really, the point is now, can you learn a different set? And since you've already demonstrated that you can learn a set, it's highly likely that you can learn another set. There is the willingness to present authentically, and that I think is actually the biggest challenge for preoccupied people. They're so used to getting everything that they need through pretending to be somebody else. And in their childhood experiences, the authentic presentation was a spectacular failure in terms of being able to get your needs met. And so we're really conditioned to think that I can't actually take those risks because my needs won't be met, and I can't regulate myself emotionally, and I'm totally dependent on somebody else doing it for me. And I can't risk losing that connection and then being in a state of dysregulation that I can't get myself out of. And so you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You just move a little bit into authentic expressions with small things at the beginning, and move further and further into authentic expression, the more you receive feedback that the authentic expression is acceptable. And I think really that's one of the hard things, that bitter part where you discover that the authentic expression is as acceptable as the inauthentic expression was, and there was no penalty in it. Make sense, Matt?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how it sounds like there's some, parallels or, with kind of what we would call codependency. And just thinking about the conditioning that you described for the child that gets enmeshed in the mind states of the adult, and how you, as for the adult to have, um, if this is my strategy or patterning, I might have very little awareness of what is happening for me emotionally, but I might have a lot of awareness of what's happening for my partner or the people around me. But is that
Yeah.
a kind of accurate?
I think that one of the things that you notice about dismissing people is there's a high level of addiction there. So 30% of dismissing people are addicts. And in disorganized people, 70% of disorganized people on the avoidance side are addicts. The controlling side of disorganization is not so substance addicted, but they get involved in these controlling relationships with other disorganized people. So you often see, for instance, in Al-Anon, a room full of disorganized, controlling, preoccupied people who are talking about their relationships with disorganized, avoidant people, and trying to demand or figure that out. On the organized side, it is often more the helplessly preoccupied tied to the dismissing person. And we would describe that as codependent in the sense that one person in the relationship is having their needs met, and the other person in the relationship is not having their needs met, but they're providing the care for the other. The of course, neither side is volitional, right? The people on the addict or dismissing side think that that's how the world works, and the people on the preoccupied side also think that that's how the world works. And so you just want to be good at the way that the world works, and so you enter into those kinds of agreements. Understand that often, or one of the ways that I hear codependency being described is that one person is taking from the other, whereas actually they're both in it and they're both getting out of that kind of dynamic what they both want. So it is in some sense a mutually agreed upon relationship rather than one person necessarily being exploited by another person, even though it it can appear that way. And to come out of that, of course, you have to address your own stuff and not necessarily the stuff in the other person. But they often show up in the work that we do as the poor dismissing person being dragged by the controlling preoccupied person, and then the controlling preoccupied person talking exclusively about what's wrong with the dismissing person. And as soon as you ask them to make the adjustment to talk about themselves, they stop coming. The experience I have often. Is that making sense to you?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm also wondering, like, where does something like, a borderline personality organization fit on kind of this spectrum of, attachment strategies where there's a lot of emotional dysregulation, fear of abandonment.
So the Masterson scale, which is the personality things, antisocial personality disorder at one end and borderline personality at the other end. One of the problems with these kinds of theories is that the way that you meet people is they're almost always a mix of things. And the way that it lays down on top of the attachment framework is the antisocial narcissistic personality tends to lay down more on top of the dismissing person, and the borderline personality tends to lay down more on the preoccupied side. But I would say that the piece that's often left out of that is that we're really talking about disorganized people when we're talking about personality disorders, not organized people. So you're really talking about a disorganization with a attachment conditioning. And when you're talking about complexly disorganized people, which is often who you're really talking about, they have the disorganization, they have dismissing strategies, they have preoccupied strategies. Some of you have secure strategies. And so it would be, I think trying to lay them in a way other than it's a complex bridging that has to go on. Mostly that's what you see.
And can a complexly disorganized person have a mix both of, secure, but also the disorganized, fearful avoidant, fearfully preoccupied,
Yeah.
a loop of everything?
Yeah. They're actually the hardest to relate to because they're so unpredictable in the way that they respond. Secure functioning relationships really are about, this is my experience, this is what I want to express of it. How do I translate it so that the person will understand what I'm trying to communicate to them? How do I understand what they've understood that I've tried to communicate so we're actually communicating? And then how do I modify my understanding of the relationship? But if you can't predict how somebody is going to respond to information that you give them, then you can't formulate it in a way that might be communicating. And so then you're in some ways restricted in how you can express it. And then you have to be open to wildly varying responses. Whereas in secure functioning relationships or in organized communicating relationships, you have a good idea of how you need to present something to somebody so that you can gauge what their response is, so that you can be assured that they understand what you mean. And that's the part that's really lost on disorganized people or complexly disorganized people. There's no way to predict how they're going to respond. And so you can't predict how to say something to them. And so the failure rate in terms of communicating is quite high. And then you're operating with these skewed perspectives of what's happening. the main difference between antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder is that antisocial people don't care what people think of them. And narcissistic people are obsessed with what people think of them. So that's also something that shows up in the attachment constellation. You might say that a D1, a hardcore, flat, no attachment system, no emotional system, tends to be more on the anti-social personality side, and the DS3, the dismissing person who has restriction in attachment and restriction in emotion is much more sensitive to that.
Thanks. Can I ask one more kind of follow-up? This is sort
Sure.
of, yeah. So I'm thinking, and I don't know if this is also sort of diagnostic question of like something like DID, or but where there's somebody who might normally, most of the time they have an organized orientation, but then certain life circumstances or relational things, they trigger them, and then this other fractured off part of their psyche comes into awareness and sort of takes over, and then they might act in a way that is more, kind of fearfully preoccupied, or one, so that it can that also be a phenomenon where sort of circumstantially a splintered off part, or I'm not sure what kind of language to use, but that it's um,
So in structural dissociation, you have the apparently normal part, and you have the emotional parts that are split off. In DID, a dissociative identity disorder, you have more than one apparently normal part, and they're not linked. So if something happens in one apparently normal part, the other apparently normal parts don't know about it. And there's no limit to the number of apparently normal parts you have, nor limit to the number of split off parts within the apparently normal parts. So remember that we make up reality based on meaning that we assign to it. We have the capacity to sense. The object can be sensed. When there's contact, consciousness of that arises. It's evaluated for urgency. Urgent stuff gets more attention faster, and then it's compared to the perceptual database. And wherever the match happens, that secluded data set is what creates the meaning of the moment. So depending on where you land, that small data set is what creates the experience of the present moment, which is why it appears differently. You're making up a self response in the present moment based on the data, and because the data is sequestered from each other, you have understandings and meanings that are quite segmented. Then you make a meaning, and then you act from that meaning, and then the reaction and the outcome is then remembered into that same sequestered part. So in the next moment, if the match is in a different part of the system, there's no awareness that that other part happened, because it's not included in the data set that you create in the next moment of experience. In people that don't have that, it's all one database. So the accumulated experiences are always available, whereas in the parts where they're fragmented, it depends which fragment you're in, what data there is to create the experience of the present moment. And so from the side of not being in that situation where you have access to the other interactions that you had with them, it seems as if there's some manipulation or some lying going on, or some problem going on, because they're presenting that that didn't happen, or they don't know what you're talking about, but they're not necessarily being manipulative. They, for the most part, don't have that experience because of where it's at. So that it does render them really unreliable in terms of being able to maintain a normal kind of discourse. So, and understand that in adults who are disorganized, dissociation is the primary means of emotional regulation. So, in order to be able to come out of dissociation as the primary means of emotional regulation, you have to develop alternative emotional regulation schemes that you can substitute for the dissociation. That's really the way out of it, to develop alternative emotional regulation strategies that are more efficient than dissociation, which is really not efficient. Good enough?
Yeah, that's good. Thanks. And I'm thinking that you would also then want to swap out the controlling and the bad, the non-functional ways for, right?
Right. The controlling strategies, while they were effective in childhood for controlling the caregiver so that the caregiver could step up and fulfill the adult roles in adult relationships, most people are unwilling to be controlled in that way. So that what you're doing is self-excluding from secure functioning relationships and self-excluding from most functional relationships, because the only people that are willing to acquiesce to that level of being controlled are people that can't function very well. So they're giving up their freedom, their autonomy to be controlled by somebody else. But the person who's in the controlling position is going to have to take on the whole care of the person in order for that really to work. And you'll notice in what the controlling person, of course, is getting out of it is constant proximity, because to be in complete control, the person can never be away from you. And so you get the emotional regulation that you need from that. And then the other person gets the dependency that they need out of it. Is that making sense? So again, even though that dynamic looks often terrible on the outside, both people are getting out of it what they want, what they think that they need, but it's also not particularly satisfying in terms of intimacy. And so there's usually a constant state of deprivation in those relationships. They don't really ever settle. There's constant chaos and constant threat of abandonment. What do you say we do a little bit of metta meditation just to wrap up? So go ahead and take your meditation postures. All right. Let go of the meditation. How's that? So on the 14th of December, I'm giving a talk about my photography, and we'll spend 3 hours going over it now. I might planning anyway to actually talk some solid technique if that matters to you. We now have AI built into Photoshop, and you can pretty much do whatever you want. And I think that's really fun. And I've been using different digital manipulation programs for 25 years. And so it's also nice in terms of the arc of that, and also how the technology is reflected in different ways in the work. So if that is interesting to you, that's on the 14th, which is a Saturday from 9 to noon Pacific. And then in January, starting on the 4th, we're going to do the level 1 series on 4 Saturday mornings. And then in February, start our level 2 classes again. So that's what's coming up. Really appreciate your practice. Nice to see you here. I will see you next week. I think one of these weeks coming up, it's going to be Christmas. Let me see what the calendar is going to tell me. So we probably won't do that. And then I think it's also New Year's, the way the calendar falls this year. So let's see. We will be here on the 12th and on the 19th. The day after Christmas, I'd play that by ear. And then, yeah, no, I guess we will be the 2nd of January. That gives everybody time to recover. Boxing Day. All right. Thanks so much. See you later.